Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our program for Friday, June 19th, Juneteenth, 2020. This program is brought to you by the Nakanee Native Program in conjunction with the Stand Up to Oil campaign. And just a word about using Zoom. We would like everyone to mute yourself until the question and answer period, which will come after the slideshow. Other than that, just sit back and enjoy. Here's Ilani Casey, Chair of the Board of the Nakanee Native Program, to introduce everything.
Good morning. My name is Ilani Casey. I'm an enrolled tribal member of the Tlingit Nation, Raven Frog Clan. Born and raised in Seattle, the board chair of the Nakanee Native Program. I'm honored to be here with you. And I wanted to just briefly say a little bit about the importance of Juneteenth. It's the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the US. And it's also an acknowledgement of African-American freedom and achievement while encouraging continuous self-development and respect for all cultures. And this is an opportunity for people to connect and celebrate and learn about the real truth of the history of Juneteenth. And I wanted to briefly share with you that I will do a brief honor song in honor of all of you, and also in honor of Derek Hoshiko and this wonderful presentation he's going to make. It's a Tlingit welcoming song. Way, 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 ah, hey, way, 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 ah, hey, ah, 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 way, ah, hey, way, ah, hey, way, 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 ah, hey, way, 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 ah, hey, ah, way, ah, hey, way, ah, hey. Oh, Ganeshjish, thank you, Ganeshjish. And now we'll move it on to Derek. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilani. Thank you, Jonathan. One moment while I start the slideshow here. Okay, are folks able to see the video? Okay, or the slides? Thank you so much. Yeah, so thank you so much for the introduction, Ilani. I'm Derek Hoshiko. I'm presenting from occupied Snohomish territory, also known as Whidbey Island. And I really want to also thank the Nakanee Native Program for this opportunity, and especially to Ilani and Jonathan Betzall for the invitation. And a special thank you to Katrina Peterson, Julianne Gale, Zarna Joshi, and so many other people that I work with and collaborate with all the time, that have made this work possible and continue to make this work possible. And I want to thank each and every one of you for being here and for the important work that you all do on behalf of humanity. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about my personal history and story and why I'm so passionate about a rapid and just transition, and a little bit about what system change really is. I'm also going to be covering oil spills and its impacts on Native communities, climate impacts, and then after that I'll talk a little bit about federal and state climate policies, and then I'll also focus on activism. And then in closing, I'll provide an overview of climate justice and the just transition, and some analysis about where we should go next. So first I want to take a moment and offer a trigger warning that some of the topics that I'll be covering are emotional in nature, that some of the slides and some of the comments that I make will be evoke grief and anxiety, and that some of the content may be triggering in other ways, in an opportunity to examine where our emotions are coming from if I use language that refers to how oppression and marginalization and other systems of oppression are playing out in our world today. So after moving to Seattle, I really spent about 10 years focusing on local living economies, sustainability, positive solutions, and looking at how we change our economy as a solution to global warming. But over the years, I really realized that solutions-oriented approaches can be oppressive because they do not incorporate equity or justice, and that this kind of positive orientation can really just lead to leading to more business as usual and not creating the kind of change that we really need to see. Since Occupy Wall Street, I was radicalized, and as I continued to see inaction on global warming, I decided to take more personal responsibility and change my career and basically focus on the climate crisis as my life's work. At the inception of the Stand Up to Oil Coalition, I had the opportunity to work with Rebecca Ponzio from the Washington Environmental Council and several other field organizers and many of the coalition members of the Stand Up to Oil Coalition. I was the person who proposed, developed, and managed the campaign's communications and advocacy infrastructure. And on the grassroots side, I attended hearings and Indigenous-led direct actions. I would say that two of Stand Up to Oil's successes have been that they have ceded their leadership, when they have ceded their leadership to the tribes, not just stepping aside with the direct actions, but also following their lead with communications and legal work, particularly around treaty rights. Secondly, they have had success when connecting with impacted tribes and settler colonial communities along the rail lines or along pipeline corridors from the points of extraction to the oil terminals and refineries here in Washington state. So I feel like the power of this coalition exhibits itself when Native American leadership is respected by the people in positions of power, when relationships are built to create trust. I think it goes well. Sometimes it doesn't go well, as with during the I-1631 climate policy, Native folks were not given a seat at the table, and that led to a lot of challenges. A good example is how in some of the fights around coal and oil and gas, the nonprofit organizations that are part of the coalition, when they've been disciplined about media and communications and taking a step back and allowing the tribes to have the victories and not co-opting those moments. Or, for example, when it can be very triggering when nonprofit organizations put donor appeals out on the heels of a tribal victory as a way to basically profit off of tribal wins. So that's a couple things that are just concrete practices that can really help to have a coalition work out in a good way. So I want to share a brief story of the most significant activism moment in my life, which was a 3-week pilgrimage to the tar sands by bicycle. So I and several other folks rode our bicycles from my home here on Whidbey Island. We kicked off the tour at March Point, the March Point oil refineries in Anacortes, Washington, and then followed the Trans Mountain Pipeline all the way to Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada, interviewing folks along the way. And this photo that you're seeing here is at the tar sands extraction sites themselves in a place called the Reclamation Loop, where they recovered 0.0015% of the land. The water that looks like it's raining in this picture, but that's actually fallout from the oil refining operations and tar sands operations. There's always weather systems that create basically a microclimate around the tar sands. And so this fallout, it is consisting largely of water, but there are toxic components. And when the bicyclist pictured here made it back to the support vehicle, the shellac had melted off of one of our riders' handlebars. And that's just in 45 minutes of riding. We had the honor and privilege of being invited to the healing gathering in 2015. And this is a picture of us standing with and giving a stevia plant to Florence, who we referred to as Grandma. And we were hosted by Florence and Jim at their home at the Gregoire Lake Reserve. This is a picture of Lake Gregoire, which is just south of Fort McMurray, Alberta, and within basically in the town of Anzac, which is just south of Fort McMurray. And these are some of the people that we were at the healing gathering with. Basically at the healing gathering, they invited tribal representatives from all of the nations in the Athabasca River Delta to have this gathering and to teach the traditional ways. And we were able to participate in that, as well as strategy discussions on what to do with the 100 or so fossil fuel infrastructure fights that they had to be fighting simultaneously, and having to pick and choose which ones to actually use their limited resources to fight. And unfortunately, just a few months after we got back, the entire region lit up in the largest wildfire evacuation in Alberta history, which was also the costliest wildfire in Canadian history, costing estimates of up to $9 billion in damage. It also forced the evacuation of the entire city of Fort McMurray of 80,000 people and destroyed about a fourth of the town. The fire came within 3/4 of a mile of Grandma and Grandpa's house. So it was something we were very concerned about and watching very closely. Here's a picture of that fire, the smoke from that fire from space. And this, being a part of this pilgrimage, the pilgrimage was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. It was spiritually hard, it was logistically hard, it was financially hard, it was interpersonally hard, it was physically hard riding our bicycles across the whole continent there. But it really gave me a firsthand experience with all of my senses, my eyesight, my ears, my nose. I could smell the tar sands, I could hear the tar sands, I could taste it in my mouth. And so it was galvanized my commitment to the work of climate justice and to the work of environmental restoration. And so in 2018, I had the opportunity to campaign with Greenpeace to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is the pipeline I referred to that we were riding our bicycles from Washington to Alberta. And there's a proposal, actually they're in the process of constructing twinning of the pipeline that would triple its capacity of tar sands oil to Washington and to Washington's waters. Being on the Greenpeace campaign, I really felt it was both a healing experience for myself and an opportunity to bring the tar sands fight home. Plus, it was a lot of fun sailing aboard the Arctic Sunrise in the Salish Sea. There's a picture of me and some of the campaigners and crew arriving at the Ballard Locks in Seattle. So just last Saturday, the Trans Mountain Pipeline had an oil spill in Sumas Territory, which is just north of the colonial border in Abbotsford. And this is a picture of an aerial photo of the spill. And climate campaigner Peter McCartney with the Wilderness Committee said, we're talking about a major oil spill in a waterlogged field that sits above the Sumas Aquifer. This is a disaster. It also happened to be raining throughout the weekend. Nevertheless, the Trans Mountain folks went ahead and restarted the pipeline before the spill was cleaned up. And this pipeline has has had 90 major oil spills in 67 years, including 4 on Sumas territory alone in the last 15 years. So this is just the impact in one spot of this 1,000-mile pipeline, and that's just one of the many pipelines, and that doesn't even refer to the oil spills that happen in water. In other recent news, the Navajo Nation, while battling the COVID-19 pandemic, have no water due to Peabody coal taking all of their drinking water. Over the years, the Peabody coal, which is the largest coal miner in the United States, used their aquifer, mixed their fresh water with coal to turn it into coal slurry, which was then shipped 273 miles over a pipeline to generate power for Los Angeles. Next, I'm going to show a video. Hopefully the audio works, but it's not totally important if the audio doesn't work on this video, but it's a video that just came out from the Center for Biological Diversity, showing oil and gas pipeline incidences since 1986. Near the end of May, Alberta's energy minister said, "Now is a great time to be building a pipeline because you can't have protests of more than 15 people." It's just completely outrageous, the hubris of the corporate state. So, you know, some of the impacts of these on land and on water spills affect Indigenous people's access to their traditional foods. It poisons the land and water. It reduces their access to drinking water. These point source pollution have a tremendous effect on human health of folks who are impacted by these projects and these accidents. Actually pictured behind me, I'm using a virtual background of the Athabasca Glacier, which is at the heart of the glaciers at Jasper National Park. But at the other end of this watershed is Lake Athabasca, which is the most polluted water, where the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation basically cannot hunt or fish, and the water is so polluted that their people are experiencing rare cancers and are basically completely devastated in terms of their food sovereignty and its impact on their culture and their people. So now bringing it back home a little bit, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Washington State is a high-risk area for oil spills due to oil transport and processing. These spills threaten sensitive environments on the Pacific coast, in the Puget Sound, Columbia River, and our river systems. More than 15 billion gallons of oil are shipped annually through our waters. Here's just a list of some of the major oil spills that have occurred in the last 50 years, courtesy of Sightline Institute. And these are just the major ones. So I want to pivot a little bit. So in 2016, after my pilgrimage to the tar sands, I was invited to give a talk on climate justice in Olympia. And there was back in 2011, I believe it was, Bill McKibben had put out an article called "The Global Warming's Terrifying New Math" in the publication The Rolling Stone. And then just here in 2016, he had put out a new article called "Recalculating the Math." Unfortunately, the math didn't add up, and I fell into self-doubt and despair for 3 days before I realized what had happened. So what we see here on the left in 2012 is that the math said clearly that we had 565 gigatons of carbon left in our so-called carbon budget. And in 2016, the recalculating the math increased that amount from the 565 to the 800 you see pictured in the center. Note that the little box in the lower right-hand corner shows the annual emissions of approximately 40 gigatons per year. So that indicates how many years are left. What you also see is in the new math, which is based on Oil Change International's paper, The Sky's Limit. What you see is also an estimation of how much is available for the 1.5 degree limit on global warming. And then at the top, you see 943 gigatons contained in our proven reserves, not including what's been explored. Actually, that's what's being extracted right now. So all this didn't make sense. It wasn't consistent with what I understood. How could you use 40 gigatons a year and then 4 years later have more in your carbon budget than you did 4 years ago? And my analysis, after incorporating that plus my understanding of how the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit works, I came up with what the limits really should have been, and then I updated it for 2017. So what we were looking at 3 years ago, because this slide is now 3 years old, was really something more like 160 gigatons for the 1.5 limit, and we probably have between minus somewhere around, we've basically exhausted the budget for 1.5. Anyway, that's a bunch of math. But I did want to take a moment to go over this. And so what I really realized from this is how there's climate denial within the climate movement. That we aren't willing to challenge the systems of power and money in order to create the change that we really need. We would rather bargain with the truth and reduce our chances of survival and come up with new machinations for where we're really at. Even the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius that was released a year and a half ago said that we needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030. However, their analysis of that we would have 10 years left to stop global warming includes some assumptions about being able to sequester carbon that are dubious at best. So people talk about the need for systems change, not individual change, but what does that really mean? So the systems that are oppressing the earth, especially patriarchy, are the same systems that are oppressing people. So what do we mean by system? The system is the systems of oppression: colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and the various industrial complexes, including the prison industrial complex, the white savior industrial complex, the nonprofit industrial complex, and so on. What do we mean by oppressing the earth? Global warming, climate change, species extinction, pollution, fossil fuel extraction, and human development of land, including sprawl, deforestation, mineral extraction, landfills, and even cut lines through pristine forests can have a devastating impact on wildlife. What do we mean by oppressing people? It's the ways that play out, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, nativism. And what do we mean by patriarchy? The use of masculine power, domination, ego, and control over people's bodies, especially without consent. Take it straight from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition of patriarchy: social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line, and broadly, control by men of a disproportionately large share of power. Number two, a society or institution organized according to the principles or practices of patriarchy. So, in the last couple of weeks, we've been seeing a lot around Black Lives Matter and racial justice. And I think it's important, in addition to centering racial justice for Black lives, we need to also be looking at the role of patriarchy and how that plays out, as well as white supremacy culture. So now on to the climate. This photo was taken from Apollo 17 as the crew was traveling toward the moon in 1972. And I always like to take a moment to recognize where we're at on this blue marble and have that be a way to ground ourselves as we look at the impacts of the changes to our climate so far. So here's a picture of flood in Chehalis in 2007. This flood closed down Interstate 5, I-5 for several days. It was the worst natural disaster in the region in recorded history, with estimates of $166 million in damage. Also, you may remember the Oso mudslide in 2014, major flooding in Carnation in 2015, and major flooding in Mason County and Ferry County in 2017. Those are just a few examples of flooding as a climate impact. Importantly, and in terms of current events, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and increases in disease and pandemics such as COVID-19 are increasingly likely in a global warming world. This occurs when human development and encroachment overlap with the natural world. Also, the melting permafrost and other ice that's melting could eventually release viruses and bacteria that have been locked up for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and millions of years, which could also impact human health. On the other side of things, the greenhouse gases lowered due to the COVID-19 pandemic, such as that typically we extract 100 million barrels of oil per day. And through this pandemic, we've seen a reduction in extraction by approximately 15 million barrels per day. And the reduction of that 3 months pretty much will result in approximately 7% reductions in greenhouse gases across the whole year. Unfortunately, that is a marginal reduction compared to historic emissions of billions of tons of carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere. However, on the kind of positive side, we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic that people are willing to be resilient and to respond to an existential threat. People were willing to make significant personal sacrifices in their lives, both financially and in terms of their daily life, in order to protect fellow humans. And so this is a compassionate approach, and it also shows that society is able to pivot rapidly when there's the appropriate leadership. Also, it's important to acknowledge that air quality in places with higher air pollution is the #1 killer on the planet. And it's conceivable that the reduced air pollution from COVID-19 saved more lives than we've lost to the pandemic. So this underscores the environmental justice aspect too, when you look at how people's ability to breathe, the people who live in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities that suffer from the worst air pollution are also susceptible more to the COVID-19 disease. And so you see these relationships between all these movements, and you see these relationships between where and how clean air and clean water are so important. I'm sure many of you recall the intense smoke-filled skies for weeks on end in recent years. This is a picture I took near Wabamun, Alberta during that pilgrimage in 2015. And this is smoke from the Okanagan complex fire that's come over into Canada. Washington now experiences 5 times as many wildfires each year on average as we did in the 1970s. And across the Western US, the average number of large fires has more than tripled since from the 1970s to the 2010s. And the area burned by these fires has increased 6-fold. Climate change also can make today's extreme events more common. For example, a 2 feet of sea level rise in Olympia could turn a 100-year flood into an annual event. And it's also important to understand how much sea level rise is actually baked in. According to Dar Jamail, for every, based on his research in his book, The End of Ice, for every part per million of carbon dioxide, we could expect to see a 1 foot of sea level rise. And right now we're 130 parts per million above normal. Could you imagine the impact of 130 feet of sea level rise here? Climate change and global warming also affects the temperature of water, which affects the fishes and salmon's ability to survive. More than 90% of the warming that has happened on Earth over the past 50 years has heated the oceans. So salmon need cold water to survive, and other fish, but the warmer water exacerbates, the warmer waters make it harder for fish to survive. Coral reefs are bleaching, this sort of thing. So we're looking at a collapse of the marine ecosystem as a result of the warming oceans. But also that warmer water expands and exacerbates sea level rise because warmer water expands in terms of its volume. There's also ocean acidification. As there's a higher content of carbon dioxide in the air, it acidifies the oceans. Ocean acidification is sometimes referred to as global warming's evil twin. This is devastating to marine life, and it kind of creates this double edged sword for indigenous communities' ability to access traditional foods. In Washington, oyster growers have been noticing that their hatcheries, that the larvae that form oysters were dying because they couldn't form shells because of the corrosive water. And this isn't just affecting oysters, it's affecting herring, it's affecting all the way up the food chain, including salmon and orcas. Another climate impact is drought. This is an image from the drought in 2015. And the increase in droughts and heat waves also leads to earlier snowmelt, which reduces the stream flow later in the season, which will affect both agriculture, the salmon, as well as the ability to produce hydroelectric power. This slide refers to the what I was talking about earlier in regard to what would be needed to stabilize the Earth. And it shows the Earth as kind of a marble rolling down this marble maze. And where we're at there with the planet headed toward the hothouse Earth, and what it would look like to stabilize the Earth at a more intermediate position. And then I'm going to take a pause after this next slide. This slide speaks for itself. This original artwork was made by Heather Alder, and the data comes from the 2016 Living Planet report. So during the pilgrimage to the tar sands, we stopped at the Athabasca Glacier and were able to see that they had kind of created this pilgrimage of its own, like a little micro pilgrimage where we hiked a couple of miles across barren rock, and were able to start at the parking lot in 1900 and walk to 2020, where we finally were able to reach the actual glacier, which had receded even further, and it's expected to disappear altogether in the coming decades. Here's a great irony with this photo of enjoy denial. If someone had put the sticker on a cone right at the foot of the glacier. And you can see at the top there, well, when you're there in person, you can see where the glacier was hundreds of feet above you. So I'm going to pivot to some climate policy pieces that are useful. So in the 1970s, we saw the Clean Air, Clean Water, and Endangered Species Act in response to the first Earth Day in 1970, as well as the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. More recently, the Federal Clean Power Plan that President Obama announced in August of 2015 set the first climate pollution limits for US power plants. In my analysis, this is the only meaningful climate policy passed at the federal level. The federal climate legislation, the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009, also known as the Waxman-Markey Bill, was to put a price on carbon pollution, was our last best chance to stop global warming, and it failed. In Washington State, I-937, the Washington Energy Independence Act in 2006, required large utilities to obtain 15% of their electricity from renewable sources such as wind and solar by 2020. And it also required that they take on all cost-effective conservation. This is the only meaningful climate policy that voters have ever passed. And that was 13 years ago. There's also I-1631 that was a proposal that was a ballot initiative in 2018 that failed after Big Oil invested $31 million, the largest amount of money that has been spent to defeat a ballot initiative in history, in Washington state history. On the other hand, last year, Senate Bill 5116, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, is the only meaningful climate policy the Washington State Legislature has ever passed. I had the honor of being present with youth climate activists in Olympia the day it was debated and voted on by the legislature. This policy requires that utilities be completely rid of coal power by 2025, and some other targets that are not really consistent with meaningful climate action, but being able to get off of coal by 2025 is important and does make a meaningful difference for Washington State and communities that have climate action plans that rely on being off of coal by 2025. So this is a huge win. Unfortunately, Puget Sound Energy is actively working to dismantle this in the rules and to find ways to work around it. Rather than shut down their coal plants in Montana, they're working to just sell the power elsewhere, which is kind of beside the point. So we see that there's been very little action on climate change in the federal and state governments. And so what we must realize is that policy isn't going to change everything for us. This quote from Audre Lorde really says it all, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I want to turn to some activism. So Washington's track record for upholding tribal treaty rights and managing natural resources is not good. Native American environmental leader and treaty rights activist Billy Frank Jr. was arrested more than 50 times during the fish wars in the 1960s and 70s. And this Native activism led to the Bolt decision in 1974. And when the state, after the order, refused to enforce it, Judge Bolt ordered the Coast Guard and federal law enforcement agencies to Washington state to enforce his rulings. This is consistent with today being Juneteenth and how the kind of following the Civil War, how the notice of emancipation from slavery occurred on from a visit from the federal government into Texas to inform them that this was to be enforced. But here we see this injustice happening right here in Washington state. In 1999, the World Trade Organization's ministerial conference was shut down when tens of thousands of people representing labor, social justice, student groups, religious groups, environmental groups organized a multi-day demonstration in Seattle, referred to as the Battle in Seattle. And this quote from Andrew Fletcher, "If a man were permitted to make all the ballots, he need not care who should make the laws of the nation." I think that for myself, this quote is a useful way to think about social change and the work that we do. It is very easy to intellectualize everything, but we need a way to connect with folks' humanity at the emotional level and at the body level. How can we get out of our heads and into our hearts and into our bodies, into our hands and feet? In 2011, Occupy Wall Street formed on the heels of the Arab Spring, the Wisconsin protests, and the 2007 Great Recession, also known as the credit crisis. This movement captivated me because it portended the change at the scale that we needed. I also believe that both the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the national protests around the police murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement is also such a moment. Here's a picture from the night that I stayed at Occupy Seattle. The overall Occupy movement was shut down by a coordinated attack by the Department of Homeland Security. This is not far from the current CHOP location in Seattle right now. In 2015, Shell No was a high-profile campaign to stop Arctic oil drilling. And this picture is of the Polar Pioneer drilling rig in Seattle. The next year, I was part of a group that was protesting the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington state, which is the oil refineries at March Point. This indigenous-led march consisted of thousands of people with indigenous speakers at the beginning of the march and at the end. The group that I traveled with was an affinity group called the Break Free Bike Train, and we had 30 bicyclists that were part of the actions over several days. The same group later worked to on a ride down in on the Olympic Peninsula, where we were challenging the Westway oil terminal, and this was at a indigenous-led march and rally in Hoquiam, and I brought my family there. And so here's a picture of my 2-year-old. He was 2 at the time; he's 6 now. And he wanted to speak out himself. Trevor and my other 2 younger sons are enrolled enrolled Tlingit tribal members, and he wanted to speak out against the oil terminal, and we couldn't really hear what he was saying. It was just, you know, a 2-year-old speak, but at the very end I whispered into his ear to say no oil, and so he put his fist up in the air and said, no, he just said, no oil. And the entire crowd erupted in cheers. And President Von Sharp looked on approvingly. So even in the less than entirely ambitious IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, they still said that we need a radical rethink in almost every aspect of society. So where do we go next? Last year, to continue a little bit more on activism, we saw that Greta Thunberg and the global climate strikes in March, September, and November, and the weekly demonstrations called Friday for the Future captivated the world. I've had the honor and privilege of being invited and to participate with Whidbey Island Youth Climate Justice organizers who formed a coalition called United Student Leaders. And they've engaged in an unprecedented number of powerful actions since September of 2019. Also, want to make a shout out to the Walk to Protect and Restore the Sailor's Sea, which is an action that is totally led by Indigenous folks. It's happened multiple years. I'm wearing a t-shirt from a few years ago when we had a bicycle contingent to support that. So I'm glad to be wearing this t-shirt. I see some other folks who had a t-shirt from this last year. And this is some photos from the one that was in September of 2019. They held a occupation at the state capitol demanding a declaration of climate emergency by Governor Inslee, which ultimately led to a legislative bill on the topic of a climate emergency, which later failed. But they were also out there demanding kind of a multi-piece platform around the role of fracked gas and petrochemicals, as well as the role of the lower 4 Snake River dams impacts on salmon and orca, as well as they kind of had a laundry list of demands that they were doing this action on behalf of. So now I'm going to share a bit of analysis about climate justice and what climate action looks like. First, it's important to recognize our privilege as the one of several roots of inaction on climate change. Many people who want to deflect responsibility will say, well, what about the population crisis? And what people who refer to the population explosion as a problem for climate change fail to recognize that it's really a minority of the people who are actually causing the majority of the emissions. The United States represents only 8% of the world's population, and yet is responsible for 25% of historic emissions. We must look at ourselves in the mirror in terms of the resources that we use and the pollution and damage that causes. Particularly if you look at the richest 10% of the world's population are being responsible for 49% of all emissions. Here's a photo from Toronto showing how little traffic there was on the street during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I just want to really put this into perspective. The changes, as I mentioned before, to the greenhouse gas emissions this year are projected to be 7%. Interestingly, this is consistent with the amount of reduction we would need to address the climate crisis each year until 2030. So while all this has happened, how could we not only maintain the level of greenhouse gas emission reductions of this year, next year, but continue that decline every year after that, and every year until 2030? I think we've all felt the effects of the scale of change needed to reduce our emissions by 7% just in the last 3 months. How do we do that much more every single year? That gives a felt sense of how much we need to be changing and radically rethinking society. So now I'd like to share a few reasons why addressing oppression is integral to addressing the climate crisis. So by the time people in power are impacted, it will be too late. So that's another way of articulating the point I already made. And oppressive systems and behavior prevent collaboration and problem solving. So patriarchy and hierarchical systems reduce our ability to be responsible. And people with firsthand experience are marginalized from decision-making. So what we really need is we need to be following the lead of and being accountable to, and we need to prioritize the needs of, and we need to lift up the voices of Indigenous and Native people, women of color, people of color, femme, queer and trans people, youth, and disabled people. These are the people that we need to be reorienting toward and centering and supporting and standing behind. And for folks who are in the work of doing anti-oppression work, we need to dismantle patriarchy and white supremacy. The systems of oppression require the erasure of interconnectedness from knowing that our health and survival are interdependent. This is another way of saying colonization. Less bad isn't good enough. The existing power structure doesn't want to change. It just wants to make marginal changes without fundamentally changing, while what is required is fundamental change. And we need an underlying values shift. That right now the values that our society is organized around is money and power, and we need to change that. So it's not just about policy or individual actions, there is a third way. So this is a picture of the Just Transition Framework. It's the gold standard framework for understanding how our society needs to transform from the extractive economy on the left to the regenerative economy on the right. It mentions the strategies and tactics that we need to get there in the arrows. And the essential piece that we really need to focus on, in my opinion, is the values filter at the bottom. That tiny text that you can't read. It's where the rubber meets the road on the conflict between indigenous values and outmoded mainstream values. I'll read, I'll just read a couple of them. There's 6 of those values. The first one says, shift economic control to communities. The second one says, democratize wealth and the workplace. And then you can read the rest at the climatejusticealliance.org/justtransition website. So what does climate action look like? We need to take responsibility. We need to be bold. It's time to try things that haven't been done before. We need to look in every sector for opportunities for the just transition. You know, sometimes people talk about climate action as a way to reduce our emissions by a certain percent per year by a certain year. Let's change how we think about that. Instead of what's the least that we could do and still have a chance of surviving? I mean, is that a winning strategy? What is the least that we can do and have a small chance of surviving? That is not a winning strategy. How about we do 100% of what we can do in 2020? And let's do 100% of what we can do in 2021. So instead of arbitrarily setting a goal, we might be done years earlier. So COVID-19 and also the national protests around police murders is an opportunity for radical rethink. And so what we really want to do is use this moment to build the regenerative economy and not return to some notion of a business as usual. And we need to think deep about what those opportunities are and what we need to do. So how do we, this action is how do we use this moment to create the new normal? We also need to be supporting people and taking action, and we need to get the support we need to take action. In Washington State, around climate, electrifying buildings and creating energy efficient jobs is one of the most significant actions we could be taking. We must eliminate the direct use of fracked gas, propane, fuel oil, especially for heating buildings and heating hot water. That's where the rubber meets the road on air quality and its impacts on the people, both at the point of extraction of these fossil fuels and at their point of use. We also need to promote and connect efforts and build community. One of the possibilities is to include and unleash the education sector. Something like 50% of Washington State's budget goes to education, and it's a huge opportunity for educators to become gatekeepers for good by building actions around climate and environmental justice into their curriculums. And instead of creating make work for students, actually organizing to solve problems that we have right here and right now. We can't afford to have our youngest generation taking 10, 15 years to make it through college and then end up with student debt that they have to be saddled with before they're able to participate in society. They need to be a force for change right now. This picture is of the Cedar River Watershed Education Center. And pictured are these drums where when it's raining, there's water from the gutters drips down on these drums, and it makes this amazing cacophony of music, which is really amazing way of seeing and hearing and feeling nature speaking to us. This is a picture of Gasworks Park, which was a synthetic gas manufacturing plant during the first half of the 20th century. And it's an interesting case study in transitioning fossil fuel infrastructure into a park that people can have a picnic at. Unfortunately, before this plant, this was an excellent spot for people to find native foods and other resources. And this gas plant devastated the marshlands that were there before. Interestingly as well, this is where we started the Break Free Bike Train. And it's also important to note that Washington State has the 5th largest oil refining capacity of any state. As of 2018, there are 5 oil refineries with a combined refining capacity of 637,000 barrels per day. So what we need to do is to shut down all the oil refineries by 2030 and have a credible pathway to support the refinery workers that would be displaced by this. All the work of Stand Up to Oil has been about reducing the expansion of fossil fuels, but if we're gonna hit any notion of climate targets, it's not just about reducing the expansion of fossil fuels, it's about drawing down the amount of fossil fuels that are being refined in our state every single day. What we need to be doing is shifting our mindset from doing what is necessary to do what is necessary, not just what is possible. So the quote that I want to leave you with is one to just bring it back to our own selves and our own hearts and ask the question from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, what do you need to be whole? What parts do you leave behind? What parts of yourself do you leave behind? I also want to provide a shout out to the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. The Nakanee Native Program works with them, and ATNI is basically it's a nonprofit organization that represents 57 Northwest tribal governments throughout the region in Oregon, Idaho, Washington, Southeast Alaska, Northern California, and Western Montana. So it's this regional body representing these tribal governments, and they have a climate change program that's you can check out on their website. So that's another resource. And then if you want to get connected with me, this is my contact info. In addition to mentoring the youth-led movement, United Student Leaders, I'm also working with people on a call for rapid and just climate action in Washington State. I'm working to create a holistic framework for climate actions based on 12 action categories. So if you'd like to learn more and get involved, you can get in touch with me. Thank you so much for your participation. I believe we have maybe some time for some questions, maybe some other activities as part of this Zoom event. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan, who will take it from here.
Well, thank you, Derek. We'll get back to video here. Hey, good job.
Thank you.
Just so everyone knows, we are recording this whole presentation, and it will be up on the Nakani website as soon as I can trim it up and edit it properly, which should take just a couple of days. We are hoping that a lot of other people, that we recognize this is Juneteenth, so a lot of people are doing other things today, but we hope to spread this message far and wide. Just what are the dimensions of the problems we face, and how can we address them, particularly with the leadership of Native peoples, as you heard Derek give the shout out to ATNI. Yeah, so if people would like to ask questions, please put them in the chat, and I will repeat them, and then Derek can respond. Derek, I hope you can quickly search through your slides if you need to, and put them back up again if necessary. Okay, so we had thought of doing small group discussions, but there's few enough of us. I think we can go ahead and either put questions in the chat, or if you're on a phone and you probably will not be able to use the chat, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, and then Derek can respond to it. So we have probably 20 minutes for this, so please go ahead.
I see Alani's asking for the quote about the masters. So I'll put that up while folks are thinking of their questions and reflecting on what's been heard. Takes a minute to get through 60 slides.
There we go.
All right, let's do that now. Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, and I think what resonates with me about this quote, Ilani, is that it really speaks to, I think it's tempting to try and gain access to money power and to use the same tactics of control and domination in order to create the liberation that we all have as our vision. And so this is just a call to just remind us that we need to be thinking deeply about our approach and where are we coming from when we speak, when we write, when we show up to actions, and how are we showing up well. There's a question. Jonathan, do you want to read that?
Sure. What are some things we can do personally to address climate change and reduce oil spills?
So on an individual level, that's a great question. I referred to the framework of 12 action categories. I don't have a slide for that, but we cannot wait for policymakers, certainly not at the federal level, or at the state level, as I said, to address climate change. So we really do need to transition these things in our own communities. And I think that a few of the places that are most inspiring to me right now are to expand the work of mutual aid networks that have formed out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then find ways to directly support people to reduce their use of gasoline and propane or fracked gas. You know, I think communities can come together to raise funds and really prioritize where are folks using the most energy, and to use an environmental justice lens on that. Where are communities most impacted by air pollution, and where are folks economically spending the highest percentage of their income on fossil fuels? So they're paying money to pollute. You know, it's the folks who are most impacted are actually spending a higher percentage of their income just to have a worse air quality and worse way of life. So energy efficiency improvements in low-income neighborhoods or other neighborhoods can have a huge effect, as well as, and whether that be like heat pumps. I've shut off my virtual background here, and I'll show you a heat pump. So right here in my own house, I have a heat pump, and that's allowed us to reduce our use of Puget Sound Energy's coal, oil, and gas, as well as reduce our energy bills. So in our own home, with these, you know, we've made it possible to have a comfortable home that uses about half the electricity for heating as we did before. So that's one example. But not everyone can afford these. We ourselves couldn't really afford these, but we put it on credit. But I think people could raise funds to help each other out and make these changes. I think we are at a moment where, if we're smart, Alani asked another question, will the use of electric automobiles help? Yes and no. We can't just create the same number of cars that we have today that are electric and expect that that's going to solve the climate crisis. But if we can find a way to share these vehicles, that could be a powerful thing. So out here in my yard, there's somebody's gas guzzling car that's parked, and they are borrowing a shared electric car that I'm sharing with 3 different households. And so whenever people are going to be driving around, they come here to my house and grab the electric car and leave their gas guzzler here. So that's something, it's a small thing, but it's been able to reduce the gasoline use in 3 different households by over 50%.
And that example brings up the idea, I believe you did raise, of mutual aid networks, of people supporting each other. We had a question asking you to go into that a little more.
Okay. So mutual aid networks, I mean, if you look at the Great Depression in the 1930s, there were people that were they were organizing in their own communities to meet each other's needs, their own medical needs, their own needs for food, clothing, shelter, and these types of things were forming. And when the federal government intervened and started creating these jobs for people that included even just digging a hole and then filling the hole back up, that actually disrupted that natural process that was happening of meeting each other's needs. And another example in a couple of other examples of how mutual aid occurs has to do with cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, consumer cooperatives that put the control of the means of production into the hands of the people. And another example is around scrip. And so in times of crises, you'll have communities self-organize forms of currency that supplement that are either complementary or replace the national currency. This is the level that we need to be looking at creating change. During COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen people delivering the things that elders, for example, need to survive in terms of delivering food or even just delivering flowers, but delivering food and medical supplies to the people who need it. And sometimes doing that by bicycle or whatever, but these are responses to a crisis, and those are things that can replace the extractive economy that that we're trying to get away from. You know, the other thing that's really important to recognize is that during this time, you know, when we talk about recovering, Amazon and Jeff Bezos alone has profited $34 billion in 3 months. He's lined his pocket and is now, you know, even richer than before. And in just the last 90 days, billionaires in the United States have actually increased their wealth by a combined total of $434 billion, while we have record unemployment. And, you know, tens of millions of Americans are out of work right now. So, you know, we're looking at inequality and the haves and the gulf between haves and have-nots is wider than it ever has been. You know, we're now at a point where it's, you know, less than 100 people have more wealth than half of all Americans. So the system it's not about going back to normal. You know, normal wasn't working for people. And so it's time to create something completely new and to be bold and to take the actions in our own communities to create that.
Okay, so I put another question in the chat just to try to get people talking on what's the proper role of non-natives in relating to native struggles. What's your perspective on that?
I think the proper role of non-natives. I mean, I think probably the most important thing to recognize, which is become more of a practice in spaces, is, you know, the land acknowledgement at the beginning of a meeting, to just acknowledge that we're on occupied territory and that folks do their inner work to understand that they are settler colonialists and that they are occupying land. I think that acknowledgement becomes the basis for recognizing where and how to show up as in the practice of allyship. But in terms of the role, you know, it's challenging because, you know, you don't want to come in as a white savior, and for folks who are white or just non-natives to like come in as a savior and like, oh, I can like solve your problems for you. That's not helpful. So that's not a good role. But there is positive roles that come from authentic relationships. And so there's a lot of dynamics at play. It's not just about, oh, let's make ask the native people to like give us work, or, you know, have them do all this labor. We have to do our own work. And so I think for settler colonialists, we need to learn the history. We need to learn what it means to be an ally. We need to learn what it means to be in relationship, and what it means to take up space and to be impacting negatively in a group setting. But really it's about relationships. And if you don't have the relationships, then you probably shouldn't be acting. But when you do have those relationships, how can you show up and support? How can you stand behind and show up? And there's also plenty of public events that occur that do demand people show up in mass. Events like the Walk to Protect and Restore the Sailor's Sea, where it would benefit from thousands of people showing up instead of hundreds of people, or when there's an occupation at the state capitol, or when there's been some amazing Indigenous-led actions that have been done in collaboration with historically white-led organizations such as 350 Seattle to hold Chase Bank accountable for their investments in extreme fossil fuels. And in that case, amplifying those messages, getting down on the streets and helping to lock down these banks is a really powerful thing. And I think, yeah, really, it's the learning and research and then amplifying the stories that are the most important.
Thanks. Okay, other questions? Okay.
I could get a little more into the just transition if folks.
Yes, please.
About that. Let's see here. Most of the time, there isn't time to talk about this. So the fact that there is time is really great. So I showed this slide of the just transition framework. And I'm gonna go ahead and take us there. Are you able to see my browser loading? Are you seeing the screen? Okay, yeah. Great. So this is the Climate Justice Alliance's website, and they collaborate with another organization called Movement Generation. So I recommend folks, this is just a short page that take like 5-10 minutes to read through the basic aspects here. But probably one of the more significant pieces here is that they refer to transition is inevitable, but justice is not. So money power and white power rooted in white supremacy culture is working to create the world that they see as a response to the global crises that we have. It doesn't mean that the majority of people are going to be on the better end of all of that. So there's principles around the just transition that are great to check out here. And then they talk about false solutions. And so often there's a lot of conflict between mainstream policymakers, mainstream nonprofit organizations that are promoting solutions that partner with business and industry. And in many cases, those are seen in the climate justice space as false solutions, and the data backs that up. There's also energy democracy. I referred to the energy burden that folks are confronted with, and so the work of energy democracy is a powerful piece. And then there's this handout that's a PDF that you can check out. It has 8 pages for kind of a medium dive, if you want to do a medium dive. And if you want to do a deep dive, there's a deep dive, which is that.
Excuse me, if we want to look this up with Google, what name should we use?
Which part?
How do we get to this with Google? I mean, if we put in,
here's the link.
Just transitions,
Yeah,
or
transition.
just transitions will get us to this web page?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, and Nakani will feature this on our webpage. We will have links to this at these sites.
Okay, this is really strange. So this here, yep, there it is. I'm gonna paste this into the chat. This is the more significant 48 pages. It's full of pictures and stuff, so it's easy to access, but it still has plenty of analysis, and I just want to really highlight this as a resource that really can unpack how you think about and frame the work of just transition and climate justice.
Could you please go back to the beginning so I can write down the title of this?
Yes.
Thanks.
I think it's important that this is not just, quote unquote, for climate justice people. This needs to be, in my opinion, the work of people in small and medium-sized businesses. This needs to be the work in the world of finance. This needs to be the work in education, and that this framework gets, that educators are exposed to this framework and that they're able to share this framework with their students and families and communities. Because this, people-powered framework has been developed over decades, and it's essentially a consensus about how we move forward. And the only reason that it's not being applied is because of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, white supremacy culture. So these tools really should be put out there and amplified.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing? I really enjoyed all of your presentation. What really blew my mind was the numbers that you gave in terms of who have been benefiting through this COVID-19, the billions of dollars that, like Jeff Bezos. And what was the total in 3 months?
In 3 months, billionaires have lined their pockets with $434 billion more. And Jeff Bezos alone, as a single human or a single person, has added $34 billion in 90 days to his pocketbook.
And so one of the things maybe that, well, could be another recommendation is advocating for taxes of the 1%. They need to pay their fair share of taxation to help pay for the healthcare and the education and the, stopping the greenhouse.
Yes, I can expand on that. Thank you for bringing that up. So, for example, in Seattle, there have been multiple proposals over years to tax Amazon, and the fascist mayor Jenny Durkan has actively worked to dismantle that at the behest of Amazon. On the other side of it, here are some results from the web. In Portland, Oregon, they did succeed in passing a tax on the ultra wealthy. That all of those funds are going toward transitioning to clean energy in the city of Portland. So that's an example of a policy that turned out to be good as a result of activism from the grassroots. Right now, we're seeing calls to defund the police. In many cities, the police budget is 25 to 50% of the entire city's budget. And these resources could be going to create affordable housing, to create community safety, to meet people's needs and to solve problems in our communities, including mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and creating healthier, cleaner air and water and land. If we were to simply redirect that funding. In Seattle, the sweeps of homeless people is really an inhumane way of addressing the homelessness crisis while spending $50 million a year to just push people away from where they're at. It's not really solving problems. What if instead we spent the $50 million building tiny homes? You know, so you know, what are we needing to do in order to support the people, and redirecting funds wherever they're being spent, whether it's being spent on fossil fuels or being spent on militarized police, or private prisons, or you know, immigration detention centers, and the federal budget on the military is another place where huge sums of money are being spent that could be put to the better use of meeting the needs of people in the United States today.
Okay, well, I think we're at wrap-up time. As I said, I'll be editing the video recording of this session, and it will appear on the Nakani website sometime in the next couple of days. We also intend to put on more presentations of this kind. We're working on one now for the fall on environmental justice from a Native perspective, which I'm sure will include a lot of the same information, but more of a lot more kind of history of treaties and how the land was actually taken and so on. So we have a professor from San Diego lined up for that, and her name is Dina Gilio Whitaker. If you have read her book, this one, As Long as Grass Grows, it's been doing very well. So she's going to be we're aiming to have her as a speaker in September. Nakani will also do a number of other programs this coming summer and fall. These are all still under development, so I can't announce them yet. But do follow us on Facebook, particularly, and also keep an eye on our webpage, because there will be things being announced there. We would also really like to have people's email addresses, because we are building an email list to be able to announce events like this outside of Facebook, which is, reaches a lot of people, but not everyone. So if you would put your email in the chat, or just email us at nakaniinfo.org, nakaniinfo.org, at gmail.com, sorry. nakaniinfo@gmail.com. Our webpage is nakani.org. Okay, so please check us out there too. All right, any final comments, Derek?
No, that's it. Just thank you so much for having me, and thank you again to the audience for all the work that you do and showing up. So good to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll see you out there on the field.
Thanks for all the good ideas.
Great job.
Hey Jeff, we're just wrapping up here,
Okay.
but it was great. You did a fabulous job.
Oh yeah, I was just like, this is really good stuff. So
Yeah.
good. I'm glad that it was a great presentation. So
Okay. So I'm gonna get started on editing the video. Oops, I have to stop the video first.